As we reflect about what is wrong with an ever closer union, I would like to start from an assumption. It is the assumption that what divides us politically today is more a matter of kind than a matter of degree. So the assumption that the new and the not so new cleavages that are reshaping European politics between conservatives and progressists, patriots and Eurofederalists, communitarians and individualists are in many and in very important ways more about kind than about degree. And that is why, as sophisticated and politically correct as it may sound, the question of moderation is in some cases a fallacy. We radically diverge about important issues, the future of Europe being one of them. And radically because our political beliefs are anchored in different, sometimes irreconcilable, anthropological and philosophical roots. So what is wrong with an ever closer union? We may say, to put it simple, that Eurofederalism, like globalism, are forms of despotism presented to us as progress. And let us start by this idea of progress, or what some would call the tyranny of progressivism. One thing that we learn by reading the works of Homer, Dante, Shakespeare, or Dostoevsky is that human nature does not change. And that is something that every conservative knows, but it is also something that very difficult for a progressist to acknowledge. And here we will find the first paradox. An idea that has prevailed throughout modernity is the idea that we can either kill God or be like him. And with this idea, because ideas have consequences, came the very dangerous principle that power, scientific and political power, can and must be used not only to dominate nature, but to change human nature itself. And this is illustrated, for example, by transhumanism. And this is connected to another trait of modernity, one that Hannah Arendt explains in her Origins of Totalitarianism, which is the fact that modernity was characterized by the progressive rejection of authority, which was replaced with power. Authority is that form of power which is legitimized by real and concrete relations. The authority of parents over their children, of teachers over their students, of the elder over the younger. The authoritative experience of bonds and belonging. But throughout modernity, we rejected revelation, natural law, tradition, conventions, and now we seem to be at a final stage, rejecting the last thing that could bind us together, which is common sense. This erosion of authority was, of course, presented to us as a liberation and emancipation path. We were now free to recreate the world and recreate ourselves. Our power knew no limits. But here is the first paradox. Post-modernity has only deepened what Leo Strauss defined as the crisis of modernity, the fact that the modern Western man no longer believed that he could know what is right and wrong, good or bad. And so let's think about Eurofederalism and why it is a form of despotism. The European Union's drive towards an ever-closer union is something that is being done discreetly, but that may bring dramatic and irreversible consequences. What we are seeing now is the final attempt to create a new sovereign actor, new boundaries, a superstate without a corresponding political community, a democracy without the demos. This is being done against the democratic demand for transparency, but it is also being done against the dictates of prudence. Prudence, which, as in the book of Proverbs, exhort us to not stealthily move back the boundary lines staked out long ago by our ancestors. A European superstate would definitely replace the natural authority of national communities by a bureaucratic, technocratic, and self-serving leviathan. Like a Babel Tower, an artificial construct built upon the rejection of our foundations that lie in the encounter, in the dialogue, in the tension between Athens, Rome, and Jerusalem. And it is important to remember that while the European conscience is something relatively recent, these roots are very, very old. But as we try to artificially build a superstate, we reject these roots. An example that demonstrates this was when the EU Commissioner Elena Dalli wanted to ban the word Christmas and names like Mary and John to, and I quote, showcase the diversity of the European culture and the inclusive nature of the Commission. The social engineering of Dalli's surreal proposal, where language plays a crucial role and thus the importance of resisting this new speak, reflects what Pope Benedict brilliantly described in a 2006 address, which was prophetic and, of course, offended some of our elites. A secular culture that rejects both faith and reason and thus denies the very foundations of the European civilization. But we cannot and we will not resist Eurofederalism if we don't resist globalism, because both want to replace concrete communities and their common good with empty slogans and vague concepts. Concepts such as gender justice, climate justice, preached and imposed upon us by a technocratic elite and presented as fragments of an even more vague concept of global justice. These ambitions are destined to fail. However, they may also cause much harm in the meantime. Globalism is destined to fail because we cannot love an abstraction. We cannot be loyal to an abstraction. And globalism aims to dissolve us in an abstract concept of belonging, where there are no roots, no traditions, no identity, no sense of familiar. So one of the consequences of embracing these abstractions, rejecting what really binds us together, is that we become more and more uprooted, and consequently more and more vulnerable to despotism. So like progressivism, globalism and Eurofederalism eventually lead us to a paradoxical situation. They promise liberation, emancipation, a sort of fraternity, but they condemn us to atomization, dissolution, and serfdom. And globalism has emerged as both a cause and a consequence of an atomized society, where the citizen became the individual, where we are increasingly ruled by unelected elites that replace democratic legitimacy, something that always requires a political community, with an agenda of empty slogans and permanent crisis. Tocqueville warned us about that in his Democracy in America, as he described, and I quote, "an innumerable crowd of like and equal men who revolve on themselves without repose, procuring the small and vulgar pleasures with which they fill their souls. Each of them, withdrawn and apart, is like a stranger to the destiny of all the others. He exists only in himself and for himself alone, and if a family still remains for him, one can at least say that he no longer has a native country." So how can conservatism, patriotism, and common sense save us from the dangers of these new forms of despotism? For conservatives, it may feel like there are few reasons to be optimistic in times when statues are torn down, books are forbidden and rewritten, events are cancelled, and Shakespeare is cancelled also. But the good news is that since the French Revolution, and some will say that even since before that, conservatives have resisted. And conservatives know that alterity requires identity, and that there are no bridges without strong foundations. So we do not have that pathos of the new or the sexy appeal of progressivism, but we do have common sense and love for freedom. We do not embrace the utopian promises of a new man, but we have no doubts about what is a woman, or about the importance of those little platoons that successfully claim our love and loyalty, protecting us against the dissolution of the new forms of political and social engineering, from Eurofederalism to cultural wokeism, climate religion, or the frenetic fabrication of human rights, of fundamental rights. A fundamental right to abortion, for example, was recently approved by the European Parliament, to the detriment of rights that are in fact natural and thus fundamental, like the right to life and to freedom of conscience. There will be more and more battles on this front, and conservatives must remember that freedom of conscience is the last bastion of freedom, and it is not a coincidence that totalitarian regimes, both in history and in fiction, have tried to eliminate it. The image of a boot crushing a human face forever is what happens when and if we surrender, accepting that 2 + 2 = 5. But to fight against Eurofederalism and its dissolution, we will also need patriotism, in a time when nationalism and patriotism have become cursed concepts. But as C.S. Lewis noted, patriotism has many faces. And let me remember here another great conservative mind, Chesterton, who more than 1 century ago made an excellent point about the difference between patriotism and militarism, when he said that the Praetorian Guard became more and more important in Rome as Rome became more and more luxurious and feeble. Chesterton said the same was true for Europe then. Well, unfortunately, the same seems to be true for Europe now. But the strength of patriotism and national sovereignty is that the nation is not an abstraction. Like the family, which is the first and most natural human community, the nation positions us in a specific time and place, connecting us to those who came before us and those who will come after us. More importantly, the nation seems to be so far the best place from where to establish a relation with the world, being simultaneously root, boundary, and bridge, and the better option to guarantee us a power that is democratically legitimized. Finally, we will need to recover common sense and our love for beauty. Divorce from common sense and the destruction of beauty are not making us happier nor stronger. We are more fragile and anxious. We are, as Pope Benedict summed up, alienated from truth, and being alienated from truth, we are alienated from beauty. In fact, the alarming pandemic of the century is a pandemic of mental health. Of course, this was accelerated by the draconian measures taken during COVID-19, but the consumption of antidepressants was already increasing rapidly before 2020, with Europeans leading the way. Also, the dramatic decline in birth rates is another sign of a culture that seems to have lost hope in itself. Europeans are less and less willing to give hostages to fate, as they become more and more hostages to a culture which embraces narcissism in the form of an obsession with self-love and self-care, and the outright rejection of notions such as virtue or sacrifice. But strong and free families are a necessary condition for strong and free nations. So renewal must start there, and fortunately, there are some really good examples to be followed. Well, to conclude, the way forward, is there a way back, or is there hope? I think this is the $1 billion question. Or on the contrary, the decline of European nations, and with them the decline of Europe, is inevitable. Does it even make sense? Some ask, being a conservative in a time when, once more, there seems to be little left to conserve. But that is perhaps the greatest strength of conservatism, a strength that lies in its capacity to renew what it is in fact permanent, starting by human nature and its long for community. And so there is always something new about conservatism. Quoting Pegui, Homer is new and fresh this morning, and perhaps nothing is as old and tired as today's newspaper. However, in a moment marked by the return of the political and the confirmation that history did not end after all, the conservatism that European nations need may be more than a disposition. It must be political, anchored in strong ideas, but also action-oriented. And finally, as uncomfortable as it may be, and as recent events demonstrate, conservatives have to acknowledge that moderation is not the political virtue of our times. The political virtue of our times is courage. The courage to say that the emperor has no clothes. Those that have that courage in active politics, or in what Gramsci described as the new trenches of modern warfare, risking being cancelled or erased, they open up a path for hope. And it bears fruit. There is a younger generation that shows us that defeat is not inevitable. They are fighting the cultural wars without fear or complexes, and they carry the hope for resistance, preserving our living heritage, and rebuilding a Europe of free and sovereign nations. Thank you.